This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Me too, I'd like to thank the organisers for the great conference and that you haven't forgotten how important it is to have long pauses for tea and possibilities to socialize, to ask even more questions that we don't have had time to ask here. I really appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here. And my paper is about elite handiwork in 18th century Europe, and it's a part of a project, of a larger project that I have just begun on aristocracy, work, service and everyday life in 18th century Sweden. And in this paper I will present you some examples rather randomly, because I'm really in the beginning of compiling my material for the new project. And the examples, the random examples here are mainly drawn from Sweden, France and England, especially from letters and diaries describing handiwork and also objects the writers made, but also on portraits and other artifacts or other objects. In early modern Europe, handiwork, or to be more precise, needlework, as we have already heard, was an essential part of elite's lifestyle and life of women. Every girl, from princesses to daughters of country squires, learned needlework from an early age, not to speak of all the other categories of sewing women. In spite of its omnipresence of needlework in aristocratic and genteel classes' lives, we know remarkably little on handiwork and its representations and meanings for the elite culture. Amanda Vickery has, among other scholars, stressed the importance of exploring early modern handiwork, which is still today, especially when connected to elite women, regarded perhaps less intelligent or meaningful activity than, say, when connected to women, books and reading, or elite women's other artistic interests, such as drawing, painting or collecting, topics that have interested both historians, art historians and curators. On the other hand, female needlework has been subject to lively interest among scholars in the form of seamstresses, milliners, modists and mantua makers, because sewing was an occupation or source of livelihood for a great number of women in early modern Europe. My interest on elite handiwork arises from the assumption many scholars have had, and I would argue still have, on the ultimate uselessness and pointlessness of handiwork and objects made by early modern elite women. Here I have had another impression, though on some comments I still thought that maybe it wasn't that useless or uninteresting. Considering this, it might be of interest to explore also the emotions that research on women's handiwork arises in us historians and scholars, though the emotions of the researcher are perhaps more often analysed in ethnology, social sciences or gender studies than in the field of history. However, the preliminary results of my research show that during the 18th century, the contemporary attitudes towards handicrafts were much more open and positive than we have thought. Maybe because the scholars have emphasized the growing domesticity during the 18th century and the privatization of female sphere and home during the 19th century, thus exploring handiwork as a female domestic activity. The objects girls and women made and the act of needlework or other handicrafts were burdened with a variety of emotions, from enthusiasm to artistic satisfaction, from sense of duty to boredom. For some women, handiwork was dull and even painful task, But there were also women who enjoyed working with their hands, planning and making objects. Also elite men performed handiwork, especially woodwork and embroideries. And handiwork was arguably less gendered in the 18th century Europe than, for instance, in the 19th century. For example, Karl Johan Aminov, young officer traveling and serving on the continent during the 7 Years' War, learned exquisite embroidery techniques and models from society ladies who were his mistresses. Later, Aminov turned his skills as social capital and enjoyable attention of other ladies by sharing his knowledge on embroideries with women of the polite society. Count Johann Gabriel Oxenstierna, a poet, diplomat, civil servant and courtier, was turning passionately in the 1760s, as were many other aristocrats and royals. Oxenstierna made small objects to give as presents to his family, kin and friends. He took almost frantic pleasure of his handicrafts and enjoyed producing small items such as wooden boxes, toothpicks and canes. In his diary, Oxenstierna refers to his turning as work and as art, which stresses the 18th century notion on handicrafts both as a beneficial occupation and as decorative arts, which one could master through discipline and practice. Even though handiwork were not essentially feminine in the 18th century, men performing needlework or woodwork were certainly less numerous than women working with the needle. Elite girls learned to hold a needle from early age and made a sampler usually when they were around 8 or 10 years of age. The samplers exposed the girls' skills in needlework and acted as a rite de passage to more demanding techniques and more delicate materials. There were many model books on the letters and symbols used on the samplers. In Sweden, the samplers acted also as a family tree, recording in embroidered initials several generations of family members. It is easy to imagine a young girl's emotions when completing her sampler: joy and contentment on fulfilling a toil, a need for approval and acceptance from her parents, and frustration ahead of a difficult and time-consuming work. To find emotions of young girls in sources is far more challenging. The amount of samplers in museum collections and private homes suggests nevertheless that the samplers were highly esteemed objects that were kept and cherished in the family. Girls in genteel families were most likely very accomplished in needlework, since it was one of the most important skills of early modern and modern women, and regarded as a representation of female duties and was practiced from an early age. This also means that many women achieved skills that equaled professionals if they were interested in handiwork and were willing to improve their skills. Amongst the objects elite women were fluent in making were, for instance, wallets, waistcoats, furniture covers, handkerchiefs, linen aprons and other artifacts that could be given as gifts, or dresses, carpets, tapestries and blankets. Elite women donated to churches frontals and other textiles they made, manifesting not only the holiness of God, but also the social status and feminine virtues of the producer of the textiles. Women devoted time and patience to these objects, since fashionable elaborated embroideries or making lace were extremely time-consuming. A small wallet could be finished relatively quickly, but carpets or blankets and frontals were projects that were completed in several years, often together with other women from the family or circle of friends, and sometimes also servants helped to finish a major needlework project. Meeting the requirements of female accomplishments, skills and virtues, all visualized in needlework, was undoubtedly an emotional process to many, especially because handiwork had such a central role in elite culture. Princess Marie Antoinette, future Queen of France, was certainly not an exception to women who didn't like handiwork and took little pleasure on it. In the 1770s, she wrote to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, that she was working on a waistcoat for the King Louis XV, but the work didn't advance and she hoped to be able to finish it in some years. On the tone of the letter, it can be read that the reason for the slowness of the work wasn't the complexity of the embroidery, but the needlework itself, which was repulsive for Marie Antoinette and represented the industrious and patient female work she didn't feel comfortable with. Needlework was an essential element of the everyday life of the European elite women, and it consisted a visible part of the social practices. It was performed privately at home, within the family, and publicly, for instance, at royal courts. Whether needlework and woodwork, such as turning, were performed by the members of the royal family, not to mention the ladies in waiting, who seem to have been constantly working on needlework, as you see here. In Sweden, the Queen Lovisa Ulrika was well known for her interests on embroidery, but also on arts, enlightenment and politics. In England, the Queen Charlotte and princesses all practiced needlework. Scholars have regarded embroidering queens and princesses as a sign of the growing domesticity towards the end of the 18th century, but I would rather consider the handiwork as a part of aristocratic sociability performed publicly. For instance, in France, both Madame de Pompadour, royal mistress, influential patron of artists, writers and philosophers, and Madame Croissart, widow of the richest financier in France, commissioned a portrait of themselves in front of a sewing frame. Madame de Pompadour fashioned herself thus not only as a learned woman and patron of arts and letters, but also as an accomplished in handicrafts and proud of it. This is an aspect that certainly would deserve exploring in detail. A rich and perhaps here in England very well-known example of positive emotions and handiwork is Mary Delaney and her fabulous artistic and technically skillful handiwork that extended from sewing and embroidering to shellwork, silhouettes and flower collage. In her needlework, Mrs. Delaney combined her interests in gardens and botany to the joy of embroidering and creating by hand. Perhaps her court dress, which is part of it is here, is the most well-known creation of hers, but she worked on numerous other embroideries as well. She embroidered covers for her drawing room chairs, made decorative aprons, handkerchiefs and coverlets as gifts for family and friends. She enjoyed working together with other women and took pleasure in helping others in their work. Mrs. Delaney relished designing her patterns, choosing the materials and colors. She chose materials with care and wanted to have best quality, lasting and colorful threads. The approval and esteem of her work by her husband and friends was apparently an important encouragement for her work, and her pleasure on needlework was strengthened by positive attitudes of her family and friends. For Mrs. Delaney, handiwork was a creative work par excellence. However, she was by no means an exception in her artistic needlework in 18th century. For instance, in Sweden, several aristocratic women were honorary members of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts because of their works in which they combined embroidery and painting techniques. An example of positive emotions, needlework and artifacts in less aristocratic circles can be drawn from the Munsterian family from eastern Finland near the Russian border. Professional and semi-professional seamstresses were trusted for much of the sewing for the family, but Jakobina Charlotta Munsterian's diary tells also about her own needlework as a young girl. She enjoyed of planning and realizing her work, which mostly was sewing for her own clothes, knitting or making fashionable small accessories such as artificial flowers. Doubtlessly her needlework and her clothes differed from the high society and were simpler in style and of less luxurious materials than in capitals, though not necessarily less creative, as suggests this example of a jacket. From 1799 to 1801, Jacobina Charlotta Münsterian made often small ornaments of human hair with her sisters and cousins, and a goldsmith from a nearby town adorned these hair ornaments with locks, and the jewelry was given to Miss Münsterian's family members and relatives as tokens of friendship and love. For Miss Münsterian, handiwork was a task that gave her pleasure in a variety of ways and linked her to her family and a chain of generations, since she worked with her siblings, her mother and her grandmother. Working together was a means to carry on knowledge, traditions and the silent contentment of female work from a generation to generation. A category of artifacts that carried traditions and the cultural codes of the nobility further are linen sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths and napkins that were richly embroidered, often with coats of arms and initials. Embroidery and also plain sewing of linen can also be closely linked to marriage. Elite girls embroidered linen to build up a trousseau, which consisted of visible parts of their dowry, and would display their feminine skills and capability as the mistress of a household throughout their lives. We have to keep in mind, however, that though marriage was an ideal objective for women, far from all elite women married. Naturally, marriage and getting married were loaded with various emotions, both positive and negative, which also had an impact on the needlework performed by women. An object, making of which was, one could hope, loaded with positive emotions, anticipation, delight, and the joy of creating things together with other women or friends, is a bridal blanket, an essential part of the girl's dowry in early modern Sweden. Amongst the nobility and genteel classes, the bridal blankets were made of silk, and they were quilted and richly embroidered. The technique of quilting and the size of a blanket meant that the work easily took months, even years, and was often performed together, using a large frame around which several women could gather to work together. These were occasions for learning from other women, both on needlework and on life of women. Not only objects made by European elites were emotional, also the artefacts needed in making of handiwork could be loaded with emotions and evoke sentiments. Since the handicrafts were performed of expensive materials with the suitable equipment, the quality of tools was essential for the result. During the 18th century, sewing tools became attractive objects as themselves, not only because of their function. For instance, shuttles, thimbles, scissors, workboxes and work tables developed to artworks on their own right and became desirable as luxury goods. To briefly conclude, I'd like to stress that elite handiwork, object made, emotions linked to these objects, and in making of them were an essential, though often too much neglected, part of the lifestyle of the high society. The handiwork wasn't an empty and meaningless activity, but an esteemed part of everyday life and sociability performed by both genders. Moreover, because of its central role in the lives of elites, especially in the life of women, handiwork evoked both positive and negative emotions. The objects women produced evoked likewise mixed feelings, which all is a significant reason to explore more the 18th century elite handiwork.